get started. So today I'm going to be teaching you all about the central nervous system and its quite fundamental reflexes, which is what I'll be talking about in spinal cord studies and neuroscience in general. I feel like in my undergrad it was briefed over, and so that's why I wanted to touch on it today. It seems basic, but it's a little complicated, and I think it's important for people to understand. So I want to start with my land acknowledgement. So the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that have been made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And so I'll do a brief introduction about myself first. So I'm a master's student right now in the Department of Physiology and Pathophysiology. I did my undergrad out at McGill, and I also did my Bachelor of Science in Physiology as well. So it seemed like an easy fit to move into a Master's of Physiology. And my project is in neurophysiology. So basically, we're looking at two systems. So the sympathetic nervous system that is involved in regulating your heart rate, blood pressure parameters, basically your fight or flight response, and movement or locomotion. And so I'm investigating a cell type that's involved in locomotion. And people with spinal cord injury have dysfunction of their sympathetic system because when you get an injury, that relay system from your brain to the sympathetic system is greatly disrupted. So we're looking at connections and seeing if perhaps there's other mediating effects that could help improve sympathetic function. Because in epidural stimulation, which is a therapy for spinal cord injury, we see improvements in these heart parameters, cardiac function. And so we think that possibly there's this interconnection between movement and locomotion and sympathetic function. So basically what I'm doing is we injected dye into the spinal cord. So this is the blue labeling. And then these are my cells of interest in this kind of pink fuchsia color. And these cells have projections that go up to the sympathetic trunk in the thoracic cord. So we're looking at if these connections do in fact exist. And we're doing so I use this software to 3D render my cells of interest. So here are the sympathetic cells. And then in red, you have the contact points from the V3s or my locomotor cells that are in the lumbar spinal cord. And so I'm just going to do a quick polling. I know Toby sent out kind of the demographics. I just want to see, I have a couple of questions, the students, myself. So I'm just going to share my screen for Chrome, and then I'll get you guys to fill out the Menti. So with the QR code on your screen, if you wouldn't mind plugging in if you're in health science, physical, and it'll start popping up. Okay. So distribution-wise, okay. Yeah, mostly life sciences. We have some health sciences in there, physical science, and then some people that maybe haven't taken any physiology courses before. Okay, I'll give a couple more seconds. Many people. Okay, if you didn't get to put in your answer, I have another quick question. Okay, so we'll go to, okay. So if you just use the scale bar to move if you've taken any physiology courses before, if you've learned about reflexes, if you know about reflexes, or you haven't had any experience with. Okay, so people are kind of sitting around that 3.5 mark in terms of physiology and reflex course. I think I would tend to agree if I were an undergrad that maybe that's how I would feel as well. So hopefully after this, you'll take away, you'll learn a bit about reflexes. Okay, so now I'll go back to my, okay. So I'm just gonna outline what we're gonna be talking about this lecture. So we'll start with the objectives, and then we'll talk about some definitions and then review some anatomy. We'll discuss why reflexes are important and then get into the reflexes themselves. So we have the monosynaptic reflex, the Golgi tendon reflex, the flexion withdrawal reflex, the cross extension reflex are the ones I'll be talking about. And then we'll do a workshop and interactive activity at the end to help us consolidate the concepts we've learned. And then we'll do a Menti quiz at the end just to kind of consolidate everything and hopefully have some fun with this too. And then if anyone has questions at the end about graduate studies or the presentation or anything in general, I'll be more than happy to try and answer them for you. Okay. So at the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe the anatomy of the spinal cord, describe the monosynaptic reflex, describe the Golgi tendon reflex, describe the flexion withdrawal reflex, describe the cross extension reflex, and be able to compare and contrast similarities and differences between the reflexes. And so we'll get started with a couple of definitions that I think is important because I'll be using these terms throughout the presentation. So just so you have an understanding in case it doesn't make sense. So you can refer to these. Oh, and I should mention, Toby must have sent out some skeleton slides for everyone. So there might be stuff that's missing. It's kind of to help you guys follow along and write in key terms or important information. So yeah, so it might be missing on your slides in case you were wondering too. So the first definition I'll talk about is the synapse. So basically the synapse is the site of transmission between two nerve cells or neurons or between a neuron and a gland or a muscle cell. And so here, let me just put my laser on. So the synapse is here in this space between the two cells. So between an axon on one cell and the dendrites of another. And then, I'm on my I'm on my skeleton slides too. Sorry guys. There we go. Everything should be there. Okay, so yeah, so you have the synapse. So it's the site of transmission between your two nerve cells. And this synapse can either be electrical or chemical. So if it's electrical, it means it sends an electric current, or if it's chemical, it's sending something like a neurotransmitter between the cells to relay the information to the brain or spinal cord. And so an afferent is something that conducts towards something. And you also have an efferent, which conducts away from something. So the way I remember this is efferent, you have the E for exit, so that means it's conducting away, and then afferent would be the opposite, where it's going towards. And you also have motor neurons, and these transmit the impulses from the spinal cord to skeletal or smooth muscle. So here in this figure, you see the motor neuron so you have your motor neuron that's kind of synapsing onto this muscle here, this muscle cell or muscle fiber. And just to review, we have the anatomy of a neuron. So basically there's different parts of the neuron. So here on one side, you have the dendrites. And so you'd have a synapse on this side with another axon, axons from another cell on this side on the left. And then here you have the cell soma or cell body with the nucleus in the middle. And you have the axon, which propagates your action potential And then you have axon terminals on this side, which would ultimately synapse on another neuron. And then here you have myelin, which is that fatty component of the neuron. And basically what helps is propagate the action potential more quickly by helping it hop across in order to transmit the signal. So you have cells in the spinal cord and brain that have myelin and don't have myelin, so that kind of determines their speed of propagation. And once we get into the anatomy of the spinal cord, so we have different regions of the spinal cord. So your cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and then your coccygeal at the end. But basically, these are involved in different functional roles. So cervical would move your forearms and your top of your body. And then thoracic is more for posture and trunk musculature. And then lumbar moves your legs, and is also what I'll be focusing on today, because that's at the level of where the reflexes are. And again, we kind of mentioned afferent. So afferent means the signal is going in, right? And so whenever you have a signal being sent to the spinal cord, it's sensory information. So something that you feel in relation is the signals are being sent to your spinal cord through the dorsal root ganglion, which is outside the spinal cord. And then it goes in through the dorsal horn, and then it, through interneurons, gets propagated, and then there's an efferent signal that sends a motor signal out. So efferent, again, for exit. And you have gray matter and white matter. So the gray matter resides on the inside of the spinal cord where the cell bodies are. And on the outside, you have the white matter, which is where all the axon and the myelin is. So that's why it's white and fatty almost. And this is different from the brain, where it's the opposite. So your gray matter is on the outside, like the cortex, and then your white matter is on the inside between different segments of the brain. So just to remember that the gray matter and white matter are opposite in the spinal cord and the brain. And so here you have rex lamina of the spinal cord. So basically it's showing the white matter being, it would be on the outside where the myelinated axons are, the ascending or descending neurons in the spinal cord. And then you have your gray matter, which is where the cell bodies reside in the spinal cord. And then you'd have the dorsal roots, which would be coming in on the dorsal side, that send in the sensory information. And then the dorsal horn, which would have the sensory processing. And then here in this ventral horn, you have the motor output, and then the efferents that send out the motor output. So the way I remember this is, so when you have sensory information coming in, it comes on your dorsal part. So imagine you have a dorsal fin. And then if you're touching your back, that's sensory, right? Because you're feeling it. And then it would come in. And then it would come out through the ventral side on your stomach. And then the way I remember this is it's coming near your womb. So that's where the motor output would be. And so this, of course, is a diagram. So I just wanted to show what it looks like in an actual spinal cord slice. So I took this image. And so here you can really see the axon myelin and then the cell bodies. So here you have that lamina outline. And then you have the gray matter on the inside with the cell bodies, like these motor neurons in the ventral horn. And then all these axon projections in the white matter on the outside of the spinal cord. So it just gives you an idea of this rex lamina and how we actually are able to use it in real life situations, and then reference back to where we're looking in the spinal cord. And so I just want to mention the dorsal root ganglion versus motor neurons. So the dorsal root ganglion resides on the outside of the spinal cord, and this is like this cluster of cell bodies. And so in this image here, this is some immunohistochemistry, and it's really showing, you can see all this ganglion here with the clusters of the cell bodies that come in that would then relay the information into the dorsal horn. And then just to compare it to the motor neurons who would be in the spinal cord itself in this gray matter, again, in the ventral horn, and then just showing the differences between the two kind of clusters of groups, and then re-emphasizing your gray and versus white matter here. And yeah, just a zoomed in photo of these motor neurons. They're big guys. And so why are reflexes important? So I'm gonna give you guys a couple minutes, maybe mention in the chat if you know anything about reflexes. I'm just gonna ask if you can answer why you think they're important and why we're learning about them today. Okay, so protect us from hurting ourselves, flight or flight response, defense mechanism, predation, faster for decision making. Yep, these are all really good answers. So I guess I don't need to teach this lecture, but okay, so let me just close the chat and I'll keep going. So they're involuntary. So at the level of the spinal cord, it is a mechanism to help us protect ourselves because they occur really quickly and they process information way faster than we do. So again, they're fast. And they do protect us from hurting ourselves because they're occurring at millisecond rates, whereas our brain needs time to process information. And so, yeah, they're involved in this processing of information and then eliciting a motor output. And they're fundamental in locomotion, which is what I'm studying and why I want to teach this to you, because we may or may not take advantage, or sorry, we may or may not take, may not appreciate how much we move in a day, and we don't think about it, but at the fundamentals of all of this is reflexes. And so when we're walking, we use flexors and extensors, and in principle, so is a reflex. And they also help stabilize in locomotion or movement. And they've been evolutionarily conserved throughout species because the spinal cord evolved before the brain, and it's helped us be able to escape predation, swim, run, jog, walk. And so they are really important. And I just want to mention agonist versus antagonist muscle groups because I might be using words interchangeably in case so you don't get confused. So basically muscles come in pairs, and the easiest examples and the ones that we'll be talking about in reflexes are the biceps and triceps. So you have your bicep and your tricep, and then your quadriceps and your hamstrings. And essentially what happens is when one muscle is flexing, the other one has to relax in order for you to be able to elicit a movement. If you had both flexed at the same time, you wouldn't be able to move. And so when you are talking about the muscle that's contracting, that would be called the agonist. And the one that's relaxing is called the antagonist. And antagonist meaning opposing force to the agonist. So next time you're in the gym, you can tell your gym buddies about your agonist and antagonist muscle groups. And then, so here, I'm just gonna mention afferents. So again, the information coming into the spinal cord, which is involved in sensory processing. So you have group 1A afferents, and they're primary muscle spindles and are fast conduction. And then you have group 1B, which are found in the Golgi tendon organ, and they're also fast conducting. Then you have group 2, which are involved in skin mechanoreception or light touch and pressure, and are also secondary muscle spindles. And then you have group 3 and 4 that are receptive to pain and temperature and more coarse touch. And then the difference being that group 4 has no myelin. So as you move down this list, so group A would be your smallest size afferent, and then group 4 your biggest size. And then as you move up, so these at the bottom, the group 4 would be your slowest. And then group 3 would be a little less slow, they're a little quicker. And then group A, 1A and 1B being your quickest afferents that relay information. Okay, So we'll get into the first reflex, or the monosynaptic reflex. This is one you've probably all most likely gotten done at the doctor's office. It's also called the knee jerk, tendon tap, stretch reflex, patellar reflex, or tendon tap, or deep tendon reflex. And basically what happens is they hit your knee, right? And then you kick your leg. And what's interesting is this monosynaptic reflex can pretty much be elicited anywhere there's a tendon. The reason they do it on your leg is because you have so many motor neurons innervating muscles that you do see a quite strong response in response to getting tapped on the knee. So if you wanted to try it right now, I don't know if you're in bed or if you're sitting at a desk, but if you can relax your knee, you can probably try and tap below your kneecap and elicit it yourself. And so what's happening is when the hammer hits your patellar tendon, it causes a stretch in the muscle spindle. So because this tendon is kind of indented almost, it stretches the muscle spindle, which then would relay an action potential through the sensory neuron into the dorsal root ganglion, which then enters the spinal cord. And then here, it synapses directly on an extensor motor neuron. So then what happens here is this extensor, or your quad, contracts. And then at the same time, you have to have an inhibitory interneuron that then inhibits the flexor and relaxes it, because you want to have, again, that balance between that flexion and extension. And so that's what causes your leg to kick, because you're contracting your quad and relaxing your hamstring at the same time. And this reflex occurs through 1A afferents, so those quick afferent fibers, and it's monosynaptic. So it means that there is a direct contact of this sensory neuron on a motor neuron. And obviously this is quite simplified because there's hundreds, if not thousands, of muscle spindles that are activated to cause your quad to contract. But this is at its most simplest, the monosynaptic reflex. And I put in a YouTube link that also reviews the reflex. YouTube is great for helping you kind of understand if you're still having some confusion. So I put it in here, and then I'm sure you can find other great resources for any other reflexes too. And so the next reflex that we have is the Golgi tendon reflex.
Camila?
And yeah.
We have a question. I'm gonna just read the question here.
Sure.
It's from Julia. When someone is double jointed, do they actually have more joints, or are their joints longer / looser and thus overstretched?
That's a good question. I don't think you have more joints. I'm not sure how that would affect the stretch reflex per se. Maybe it would be less strong because you already have a looser tendons, right? So you might not elicit as strong a reflex, but I'm not too sure about that one. Good question though.
Awesome. Yep, keep going. Yeah. Okay. And also, guys, if you have questions, don't be shy.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I mean, if you're at the doctor too, sometimes they tell you to not focus on your knee because then you can't elicit a strong reflex. So it's sometimes in your head, but even though it's fundamentally not necessarily involving your brain at all, but yeah. So this next reflex is called the Golgi tendon reflex, and it's there to prevent excessive load. And Camillo Golgi, who is an Italian anatomist and pathologist, was the one it's named after, mostly because he was a pioneer in neuroscience. He created La Reazione Nera, which is means the black reaction, and it's a staining technique that used silver nitrate. And he also has a Nobel Prize with Santiago Cajal Ramon. And so he's discovered a lot of things. So this is why they named it after him. He is a pioneer in finding a lot of the Golgi. He discovered the Golgi tendon, among other things. And then, so yeah. And so, okay, so here It's similar to the monosynaptic reflex, but a little bit different. So this time, when the Golgi tendon senses an excessive load coming from this contraction of the muscle here in the quad, what happens is a sensory neuron will then conduct an action potential through a sensory neuron that goes through the dorsal root ganglion into the dorsal horn. And then here, there's interneurons that are involved. So you would have an inhibitory interneuron that then relays an inhibitory signal to this contracted muscle to inhibit the contraction, allowing it to relax. And at the same time, you have an excitatory interneuron that is relaying its signal through the efferent ventral horn out and then causes the hamstring to contract. So it's the balance where you're preventing excessive load on this already contracting muscle by causing it to relax and then putting the load on the other muscle, which contracts. And so at this point, this reflex is disynaptic, meaning it has two synapses that are involved. And because it's the Golgi tendon, it involves 1B afferents. And so you might be asking when this one might occur in real life. And this is when there is high force on the Golgi tendons. So it causes relaxation of that strong force. And so your best real example would be when you're lifting weights. Your Golgi tendon senses how much tension you're creating and how much the muscle is exerting. So too much muscle tension inhibits this muscle from creating in more force to prevent injury. And so basically it's helping you prevent muscle ruptures and tendon tears. Okay, so then here is a bit of a chart kind of contrasting the similarities and differences. So basically the tendon tap is just a feedback mechanism, whereas your Golgi tendon reflex is negative feedback. And then your tendon tap is controlling your muscle length, whereas Golgi tendon reflex is controlling muscle tension. And this tendon tap causes muscle contraction and then relaxation of the antagonist, whereas your Golgi tendon reflex causes relaxation and then contraction of the antagonist. Your tendon tap is really sensitive, and then your Golgi tendon is less sensitive, but can also override the stretch reflex if you have too great a tension elicited. And then these are both ipsilateral reflexes, so it means that there's no information crossover to the other side of the spinal cord. So if you have, for example, if you get the tendon tap done on your right leg, it all stays on the right side of the spinal cord. And same goes for the Golgi tendon reflex. And your tendon tap responds to passive stretch, whereas your Golgi tendon reflex is responding to changes in muscular tension due to contraction of that muscle. Okay, and this one, I don't recommend you do this one, but I'm sure everyone's had this happen to them at some point, and you can thank your reflexes for not getting a severe burn on your hand. So in this case, what happens is, say you touch a hot stove, or your nociceptors or the pain receptors in your fingers are stimulated. This stimulus is sending an action potential through that afferent pathway into the dorsal root ganglion, into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, where you have interneurons. And so again, you have an excitatory interneuron that travels through the efferent side, through the ventral root, through the ventral horn, through the ventral root, onto your bicep, where it flexes and helps you pull away or draw away from the stimulus. And at the same time, you have another inhibitory interneuron that goes and inhibits the contraction of your tricep, causing it to relax to, again, allow you to pull away from your stimulus. And so in this case, the flexion withdrawal reflex is at least disynaptic, because it has at least two synapses here involved with these interneurons, but it's most likely polysynaptic, meaning there are multiple synapses involved. And what's important here to note is this reflex occurs before the sensation of pain, because if you kept your finger on there until you sense pain, you would probably have a way more severe burn. than this reflex, before this reflex has occurred. So it's really fast. And then here you have an ascending signal that's sent to the brain as well, because then afterwards you notice, oh, okay, that hurt. And then this signal crosses the spinal cord, the one that goes to your brain. And yeah, again, reflex occurs before the sensation of pain, which is pretty important. And now the crossed extension reflex is pretty similar again to the flexion withdrawal reflex, only this time the crossed extension reflex is only occurring in your legs. And then, so it's kind of a balance between, you know, like you have to coordinate two limbs in this reflex. So basically, you step on a Lego, you step on a tack. This is when that happens. So if you have a painful stimulus or any type of stimulus that activates a nociceptor, this stimulus will be sent again through the afferent pathway into the dorsal root ganglion, into the dorsal horn, and then here you have interneurons here. So basically what's happening is when you step on that painful stimulus, what you're going to want to do is lift that foot off and then transfer the balance or your weight onto the other foot. So it's involving two sides. And so what happens if you have an excitatory interneuron, and then it relays its excitatory signal through the ventral horn onto the flexor muscle or the hamstring, causing it to contract. And at the same time, you have an inhibitory interneuron that sends a signal to the quad, causing it to relax. So this allows you to kick your leg up off the stimulus. And at the same time, you transfer your weight to the other side. So you have an excitatory interneuron that travels through the ventral horn, out through its efferent pathway, and then causes your flexor muscle or hamstring to relax, and then contract your extensor muscle, so you can put your weight on this leg. And again, it's probably at least disynaptic, but most likely a polysynaptic signal. And then at the same time, you have a signal that's sent to your brain, which crosses the spinal cord, telling you, oh, I stepped on something painful. Okay. And so now, so I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes. So basically, I want you guys to draw out, if you have pen and paper, or type it out, basically write out the main steps in the in the different reflexes. So you have the monosynaptic, Golgi tendon, flexion withdrawal, and cross extension reflex. So if you can kind of write out your main takeaway points, or kind of the main pathway it goes through when you have those reflexes. I'll give you some time now. Okay, so just so you have an idea, we're getting responses in the chat, which is really good, or if you're doing it on your own, that's fine. So everyone has a different way of kind of understanding the main points. So keep doing the other ones. I'm just trying to show an example of what I want you to maybe sort of write down. Maybe this is similar, maybe you have more detail, but basically the main steps for your tendon tap reflex are that tap, which would activate the stretch of the muscle spindle. And then you have your sensory neuron sending an action potential through the dorsal horn to the spinal cord. And then you have different synapses where you have your extensor motor neuron causing contraction, and then an inhibitory interneuron causing your hamstring to relax. So yeah, I see people writing in the chat, which is good. Okay, so I'll move on to the Golgi tendon reflex. So yeah, just look at kind of the main points. You don't have to write out huge paragraphs. It's just kind of the key steps involved in these reflexes. So again, basically your Golgi tendon is sensing this excessive load, which causes a sensory neuron to send an action potential through the dorsal horn to the spinal cord. And so you have interneurons in the spinal cord. So you have a motor neuron causing your quad to relax or inhibiting the contraction. And then you have another motor neuron that stimulates the hamstring to contract in response to the excessive load sensed by the Golgi tendon. And at the same time, you have your information being sent to the brain. Have people gotten to the flexion withdrawal reflex, or do you need more time? Someone can just write in the chat. Give a couple more seconds since I'm not seeing anything. Oh, okay, yeah. So you might have your answers from the skeleton notes, but if you're rewriting it out, that's great. If not, you have my answers. Okay. We'll move on then to the flexion withdrawal reflex. So as you can see, the little diagrams get a little bit more involved at this point. So basically, with your flexion withdrawal reflex, again, you have this nociceptor that senses a stimulus. It can be painful or not. And then as long as it's activated, it sends an action potential through the sensory neuron to the dorsal horn in the spinal cord. And then here you have your interneurons in the middle, where you have an excitatory interneuron causing a motor neuron to contract, this bicep to contract. And then at the same time, you have another motor neuron that inhibits the tricep so it relaxes. And then at the same time, you have your information that's being sent to the brain, which crosses the spinal cord to the opposite side. And you have this reflex that's done before the pain sensation. Okay. And then we'll go to the final one, the cross extension reflex. So similar to flexion withdrawal again, but this one happens only in your legs. So you have the stimulus sensed in the nociceptor of your foot. You have an action potential sent through the afferent pathway through the dorsal root ganglion and the dorsal horn spinal cord. And you have your interneurons again. So on one side, you have the hamstring that contracts via the motor neuron, and then you have your quad that relaxes via another motor neuron, and this is on the same side of the stimulus. And at the same time, you have other motor neurons on the opposite side of the stimulus causing your quad to contract through a motor neuron excitation, and then the hamstring relaxes because of motor neuron inhibition. And then again, your information is sent to the brain, and this information crosses the spinal cord and ascends on the opposite side. So basically, so we have some key takeaways that we've had from this lecture. So we've learned that these reflexes are fundamentally important in protecting us from injury and underlie more complex movements. They occur at the spinal cord, they're involuntary, and there are different types of reflexes as we learned today. So I really emphasize extra resources. YouTube always has great informative videos. And so if you have any questions, you can also look at these. And if you want to learn more on reflexes. And I really thank you for being active participants. You are the ones that showed interest for all of this. So if you have any questions, I'll take them now. So